How do I tell them I don't want to see that movie?
You are listening to The Hamster Village, the show about mixed relationships.
The Hamster Village.
The Hamster Village.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hamster Village, the show about mixed relationships. I'm your host, Nathan Brannon, as always, and today I want to kind of start off a little different. I want you to think about your own life for a second. Think about all you know concerning race and the society that you live in. You probably feel like you got the gist of what's going on around you, right? The music that's popular, the jobs or opportunities that may or may not be available to you. Even as far as knowing which groups in that society might get you in terms of your own experiences. Now imagine traveling around the world through many different racial customs and filters and starting over. Having those things that you're familiar with swapped, disconnected, turned on their heads in every new place. How would you navigate that? How would you center yourself, I guess, is probably the better way to ask that. In this episode, we examine all of this with a guest that has experienced and answered all these questions long ago. Say hello to our guest, Aisha Alpha, a mixed comedian, writer, and actress currently living in Los Angeles, but is originally from Canada.
Hi, my name's Aisha Alpha, and I am a comedian and an actor, writer, and host based in Los Angeles by way of Canada, where I grew up. But I was born in Nigeria. My family on my dad's side's all Nigerian, and they all still live there. My dad's the only one who left. My mom's side is half French and half English, but she grew up in Canada and was born in Canada, and they all live in Canada and are mostly like country, rural, farmers, people of the earth, like salt of the earth kind of people. But I grew up like kind of all over Canada and then moved to South Korea and then studied for a bit in France, and then now I live in America. So I'm kind of, yeah, it's a situation like you're talking about, you know, it's like all over.
That's a lot of thumbtacks.
Yeah.
In this first segment, we get to know Aisha and her family dynamics growing up in Canada to interracial and international parents. With her dad being a professor from Nigeria and her mom coming from a French-Canadian agricultural background, she has had the opportunity to be exposed to many different cultural practices and racial atmospheres. We talk about her travels to Africa, being added to groups solely because of her outward appearance, and how that has affected her sense of identity growing up. Let's take a listen.
And I've traveled to many a place. And my dad still now, he works half the year in South Africa. So I go back to South Africa with my family sometimes and do comedy out there. But I feel, it's funny how like South Africa feels more like home to me than Nigeria does, because I never really spent a lot of time there. And in South Africa, you know, obviously there's the whole like, there was apartheid and there's like clearly different kinds of races, but like an interracial race exists there. So I feel like, oh, I see my people, you know, and then in Nigeria, they're like, who's this white girl, you know, because I'm mixed.
Oh, yeah,
so.
that would make perfect sense. Yeah, there's a huge population, like comparative.
Yeah, it's I mean, they have like blacks, they have whites, and they have colored, and which is offensive to maybe some people, but like colored is just the name of like interracial people.
Okay.
Yeah,
wow.
and they have obviously other races, but.
So growing up, were you kind of just globetrotting all over the place?
No, I mean, I grew up in Canada. Like, that's where I was based. That's where my family lived. My dad did some sabbaticals in the States. Okay. And we kind of came to visit him, but he'd be away for like a year, and we would come to visit maybe twice, and he would come home a bunch of times and stuff. He's a university professor, so cool. He was doing his grind, trying to get like some, you know, real secure spots in different places. But yeah, I grew up from when I was 2 until I was 22 in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
and just traveled for soccer. I was a soccer player before.
Oh, nice.
So I traveled for soccer and traveled to see family and sort of traveled around the world and doing different things. But yeah.
Wow. So it sounds like your family's still they're connected with each side, like their history and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, my mom's very cute. She was learning French for a while because she's French, but she totally, she's not. We're not really connected to necessarily the French because her dad's from France. Her dad's family is from France. Her mom's family is from England, but they were Canadian and like lived in Canada for a long time. And it's always like a lot of these confusing things. So in Canada, there's French Canadians, English Canadians, and they're francophones, but they're like Canadian French, which is different, like Quebecois. So we're like, I'm French and English, but not that kind. Like I'm a different kind, where it's actually from France and from England. And then my dad's from Nigeria, but like he's not a very like typical Nigerian man. So they're like, oh, you have an immigrant dad from Nigeria. I get it. I know what's up. And I was like, no, but he's different than that. Like it's not the same. And like I was born there, so it's just like every time someone's like, "Oh, you're part of this group," I was always like, "Well, with a caveat and like an asterisk beside my name because it's a little bit different from everyone else's experience."
I was just thinking that like there's got to be a lot of like just explanations, like every conversation like 15 minutes.
It's like a lot of, but it's funny because I have a joke about this where I came to America and everyone's like, "You're black," and I was like, "Oh, okay." And the experience of becoming a different race in people's eyes is an interesting one as well, because I kind of feel like, this spy or something. Like I feel like I'm culturally appropriating a lot of black stuff because people are pushing it on me to be like, our experience. And I was like, I don't know, I'm from Canada. Like I grew up with like very, progressive parents. I grew up where racism was more towards indigenous people than to me necessarily in the same way that it is here. So it's just like such a different, there's always this, kind of feeling about my identity.
So I guess like there wasn't a lot of pressure from parents and things like that. Well, as far as like you knowing that you're mixed, do you know what I mean?
It's funny how like, the place that I went to school to was a lot of, I grew up in Winnipeg. I went to Victor Major was the first school I went to. So there was a lot of different races, but it was, I don't know. I guess when I was growing up, we didn't really talk that much about race in our household. My parents experienced a lot of racism from both of like, the places they lived and their families and all that kind of stuff. I mean, also because they got together and 6 months after a meeting got married, and then like, it's like, it was a crazy story, even if they were the same race and same religion, which they weren't.
As Pusha T would say, when you know, you know.
Yeah. Well, and they're still together now, so I guess they knew. So, but I didn't really think about being a mixed race or that I was something specific. I knew that I was not white necessarily, because I think when I was with my mom, people were like, which one's your mom? And I was like, the lady next to me, you know what I mean? And my mom's like white and blonde, so they were
the same
like,
t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Her shirt says mom to Aisha, like it's just, so I knew that I wasn't white, but I didn't necessarily consider myself black. But like, as far as dating certain races or having friends with certain races, that stuff didn't exist because we grew up in a place where my parents had fought so hard to sort of have the freedom to be in love with whomever they wanted, regardless of religion, regardless of race, regardless of background, or, so my parents are very much like, figure out what you want to do and do it and stand up for yourself and like fight for things. So, but I didn't realize that I was I didn't realize that I was mixed, I think specifically, until that experience in college, in university, I had this experience of being like, oh, I'm something even different from this generalized cloud people call black, So it was it never really came up that much for me. I mean, lots of things didn't come up for me. The fact that like women shouldn't do things was like not a thing in our house, or like, because you're this race, you shouldn't do this, or you can't go there. Just those barriers were like not necessarily like taken down, just never discussed. So it wasn't a thing,
Yeah. In this next segment, I asked Aisha about the racial climate growing up in Canada. With Aisha being exposed to the atmosphere here in America for a while, I wanted to know what differences or similarities she noticed compared to where she grew up. We talked a lot about the indigenous groups in Canada and how they get treatment similar to African Americans here, and how that advocacy work with those groups allowed her to connect further with other marginalized groups around the world. In fact, Fighting for those marginalized groups was great preparation for challenges she later faced, like playing in an all-men's soccer league in South Korea, being a drummer in a band when many places around the world still couldn't get their heads around that, and doing stand-up comedy in an atmosphere that is just now being addressed for its male domination. It's a great discussion about choosing fight over flight, so let's hear what Aisha has to say.
Like, I haven't been to Canada a lot, but yeah, it feels like there's less pressure on the dividing lines of race up there.
It's kind of like it is and it isn't. Where like, Canada has a lot of racism. It's just coded and very passive aggressive, and where no one's gonna come out and call you the N-word to your face, but someone might not hire you or might not be comfortable with you dating their kid if you're considered black or something, right? But the real big divide, like in America, obviously there's huge issues between like black and white. That's like when people talk about racism generally, I think that's what they're referring to. And in Canada, the big divide is Indigenous and everyone else. So it's a very different experience of what people call racism, although racism can exist between any kind of races and stuff. But I experienced myself wanting to stand up for and be an ally with and create motion in the movement for Indigenous people in Canada, because I feel like they've suffered. There's a lot of suffering that's happened there, but they've suffered in a way that's sort of similar to the way the black experience in America.
I see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So kind of growing up in that atmosphere when you started working for Indigenous groups and fighting for Indigenous groups.
It's not even like I was an activist at all. I just like in my mind, the things I think are unfair, my mind in Canada first goes to Indigenous groups. When someone says racism, the first thing I think of is like, not black, white, it's Indigenous people and like the suffering that they've gone through and the genocide that like European settlers put on them when it comes to culture and religion or spirituality and family and language and everything like that. So I mean, I had friends who were Indigenous, and like I really appreciate that spirituality and that culture. And can't understand why anyone would want to like stamp that out. So I'm very much like always standing up for it.
Yeah, I was wondering too, like if like you, like you're encouraged to like do what you want to do, be who you want to be, and then you encounter this group that others are like, nope, you can't be that.
Yeah.
So, was that like a new turning point, I guess, or
I mean, I'm always I think I'm one of those people who. The hairs in the back of my neck stand up, and I get very like, there's the fight or flight, and I'm very fight when it comes to people saying you can't do that because of some random thing. Yeah. So if it's because, you can't do that because of your race or your background or your age or your gender or your sexuality, I'm like, nope, let's talk about it then, and I'm very much like, in my life, I've done things, I played in an all-men's soccer league in South Korea. I was a drummer when they were like, girls don't drum. And like, now I'm a comedian in a world where they're like, I've heard so many people say like, women are, you're funny for a woman. And I'm like, then let's do this, like, let's go.
The knuckles start cracking.
Yeah. So I think it's just part of, maybe because of my background and like what my parents have gone through, it's sort of, not really, we talked about it a lot, but it's been instilled in me that like, if someone says you can't, and you want to, then you step up and you prove that you can. Yeah. And you keep going until you prove it.
It's kind of cool. It's kind of like it kind of prepared you for the other, like when you get into comedy, for example, or it's just going to different places where they're like, nope. It's like, actually, no. I get it.
In this next segment, we talk about Aisha's work in comedy and whether her mixed heritage was difficult to address on stage compared to other aspects of her life. I found out that it was actually flipped for her. She talked about her interracial experiences long before anything else. It makes perfect sense when you think about it. For so much of her life around the world, her being mixed race was always at the forefront. Her family was very well known in the area that they grew up in, and her family never shied away from who they were. It was easier to talk about the things that were already out there, Her true feelings, things that you would only know by getting to know her, took a little longer to tease out on stage. We also talk about the representation of interracial families and individuals in entertainment and how that affects her mindset about roles in the industry. If you remember from our past episode, Interracial Inquiries Bowing Out, we talk about Amandla Stenberg and her difficult decision turning down a role in the blockbuster Black Panther due to being too light-skinned compared to the rest of the cast. Here we expound upon that situation, pulling from Aisha's own experiences. It's an amazing segment about how mindful you must be, especially in entertainment, of the way that you are perceived by the masses. So let's take a listen.
And even when people, as a comedian, they'll say things like, I really don't find women funny, but you were great tonight. You really impressed us. I will make sure to not just go, thanks. Because I feel like I'm encouraging this idea that you should expect women not to be funny. So I'll say, I appreciate that. And also I want you to know that also comes across as an insult at the same time. And you can just tell somebody you found them funny and not add this other stuff, because that kind of is a backhanded compliment.
It's so nuts that it's 2018. We're still, ugh.
It's hilarious. The amount of people who, when I talk with them about the industry or being an actor or being a comedian, they're like, so what is it like being a Black woman? And you're like, I don't know how to answer that question because I've never been anything else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And obviously people can change genders and stuff like that, but generally you have an experience of who you are when it comes to race and gender, that you can't really express any other thing, because it's just when someone looks at me, that's what they see. So it's not like I can be like, haha, just kidding, I'm Mexican or something, or or I'm a white person, or I'm a whatever. It's this is how I'm perceived, this is who I am, that's how I'm gonna get treated, those are the things I'm dealing with. But they've always been that, so I'm just existing in the bubble of what my gender, in quotation marks, and race, in quotation marks, are.
You ask them what their experiences are, and it's like, yes, that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
What is it like being a white man? It's just great. Yeah,
how much time you got?
Exactly.
Man, so that's so you talk about your family and things like that in your comedy.
Yeah.
Did it take you a while in comedy to kind of address that stuff, or kind of like with the rest of your life, just straight out of the box?
I think that was the first thing I talked about.
Yeah.
Is one of the big things was write about what you think about or what you know. And that was something that was really in the forefront of my brain when, being a woman or being someone who's got mixed heritage or has a Black dad or a white mom or this kind of stuff. Yeah. It's stuff that always comes up from outside sources, I think, a lot towards me.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about that first. And honestly, for the first couple sets that I did, it was all about my family. And about that Black-white mixed kind of perspective. And then at one point I was like, I've painted myself into a corner. I can never talk about anything else. How do I do comedy, And then I started talking about other things.
Yeah.
But that's really that was the first step I took in comedy, was talking about family and the interracialness of it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Put it all on the table first.
Yeah.
That's what, in this business, in comedy, that's, you get worried, kind of like in film, where it's like, oh, I don't want to get typecast into a certain box, and then,
right.
But you want to be genuine to yourself and to the audience.
Really, it was for me, it was low hanging fruit, to be honest. Talking about my family, I was already sort of a public person at that point, because I had played soccer professionally. I had kind of done these things where I was in the public eye. I had done a lot of motivational speaking and doing that. I was a host of an online lifestyle channel in Winnipeg before I started doing comedy.
Yeah.
So I had no qualms with speaking about things that were in the public. And also, my brother's a musician and he's a radio host. So it's my family's already a public family where I'm from in certain ways. So it was really low hanging fruit in that it wasn't hard. It didn't feel vulnerable at all to talk about that stuff. And it wasn't until later on in my career, when I was really going through some hard stuff after a breakup, that I started talking about myself and other things than what everybody else always asks me about, being gender, race, those kinds of things. And that's when it was really vulnerable and hard. And I felt like, oh God, either this is going to work or I'm going to feel so embarrassed and never come back to a stage ever.
That's so interesting. You're the first comedian that I've had on the show where it's it's like the opposite of what other ones say, where it's like, yeah, it took me a while to work up to it and be, but I guess like you've had so much life experience. It's like that part is like, oh yeah, that's been taken care of a long time ago.
I'm like, everybody already knows who my parents are in my hometown. Everybody already knows my brother. Everyone already knows, like, you know, stories and stuff about our family. Like my mom is a microbiologist, or, you know, she's retired now, but she used to tell stories about living in Nigeria, being a white woman, and like different diseases and stuff.
Oh, wow.
And like literally she told, like, and she would teach the first year med students. So she would tell stories about my brother and I, and like illnesses or parasites and stuff we had. And then my friends were getting into university and they're like, so you had worms when you was a kid? And I was like, oh my God, like, Mom, come on, you know, like that, like the stuff that's just sort of out there. It was very personal, I guess. It is kind of reversed from a lot of people, maybe. And then it was like, in general, I was a very, very private person for so long about my own, you know, myself, my emotions, my fears, my wants, all that kind of stuff. So that was the stuff for me that was really, really held close and hidden. And when I opened up that box is when comedy for me really shifted and changed. But yeah, I think the racial stuff, the family stuff is like, no problem for me. Let's talk about it. You know, it's all out there.
That's awesome. I guess kind of going into that, representation has like been a big topic. Representation in media, especially with mixed people and interracial couples, interracial families, and things like that. Being on the other side of that, as far as entertainment, does that cross your mind a lot? Like you considering yourself as a like a role model to other mixed people out there, or this is a poor choice of word, but like an ambassador to people.
I have a sash that says mixed.
Every showcase.
Yeah.
The puffy gowns that they wear at graduation.
Yeah, the pageant gown. Yeah. No, I mean, to be honest, I think that the way that I look, being a mixed woman, you know, I'm not too dark, I'm not too light. I've got freckles, which is an attractive trait for people who want mixed, like people on TV. Yeah. I've got naturally curly hair, but it's not too curly and it's not too, you know, I'm sort of that midway black. My brother, what does my brother call it? It's like the gateway black, you know, gateway black. Which is like, it's a weird space to be in, because I feel like people look at me and they feel like, oh, she's okay. You know, that sort of like, she's black, but this thing, which, you know, is there's so many things wrapped up in that, because it's put on me like she's black but she's okay, but also I'm like, I don't really necessarily identify all the time as black. Like I think in Canada I was identified as like mixed, and they talk about your heritage and stuff, and here they're like, she's black but she's light skinned and it's okay, and like we can put her on TV and it's easy. But then you know you hear the plight of like a black woman who's dark skinned, and it's like, that's hard. Like that's a really different thing that I can never experience and never be a part of and never really talk about or speak to, because I haven't had that experience. So it's, I'm like, I don't know if I feel like an ambassador or whatever, you know, I don't feel like that, because I feel like I've had a really easy route in as far as the category of being, you know, quote unquote black. Yeah. I've had a much easier time than a lot of other people have or will. If like Lupita, you know, like she's dark skinned, she's curly hair, and her name's Lupita Nyong'o. Like it's like a hard, like it's like, you know, even my name, it's I have an African name, but it's like Aisha Alpha. It's easy, you know, like all that kind of stuff wrapped up in it.
We talked about earlier on another show about Amandla Stenberg. She played Rue in Hunger Games, but she was slated to play a part in Black Panther, and she turned it down because she felt she was too light skinned to be in with the rest of the cast, and she didn't want to take away. I think like her explanation was she didn't want to take away a spot from like a darker skinned person. Does that run in your mind a lot when you're
I mean, to be honest, not for me, because I'm not getting offered roles in Black Panther. If they're gonna offer me a role, like I don't know if I would want to, you know, do the whole Saldana taking Nina, like that, when she took the role of Nina Simone, Zoe Saldana, it was like, I think everyone was like collectively like, girl, don't do it. Like, what are you doing, you know? But yeah, I mean, that's commendable for that actress to decide not to take that. I think that there has to be more of that, people standing up and saying, I don't feel like this is the right thing for me. There's somebody else who can play this better, that's available to play that, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's been a lot of talk about that since Skyscraper, with The Rock playing an amputee, and people playing trans roles when they're not trans, and that's shifted over time, because I think now there is movement where people are recognizing that there might not be a blockbuster level amputee actor to play that role instead of The Rock, but that's not because there probably isn't somebody who could. It's because there hasn't been a route for them to get to that level necessarily.
Yeah.
So all that kind of stuff, and I mean, it's a double-edged sword, because I think as actors, you should be able to play things that you're not, and in addition, I think everyone should be able to play whoever they wanted and whatever they wanted to, if the playing field had always been equal or level and you could choose from everybody. You know, I think that's the issue there, is that it's not an equal playing field. So you don't really have all the options to choose from. So that's where it's problematic.
Okay, cool. Wow. Yeah. There's gotta be so much to just constantly, like, you gotta know the lines. You gotta think of all this different stuff about the part. And then on top of that, you're like, now I got to think about what people watching this, if they're going to be upset.
I mean, I really am excited for the day when all those things really matter for me, because right now they're like, we need someone to play. Like, my biggest role in America so far, I think, has been, I did an episode of Criminal Minds, and it had nothing to do with race, gender, anything. It was like, I just got to be kidnapped and like be a badass. Like, that could be played by anybody. Great. I don't have to worry about that stuff. Hopefully there'll be a time where I have to worry about it, and I decide based on what I think is right and wrong in the world.
Fantastic.
But
Me
I mean,
too.
offer me all those roles, guys. I mean, I'm taking offers right now.
Yeah. I would like to say that I am also looking for roles. If you need a Mr. Potato Head looking black dude, I got that down. I can wear any kind of glasses.
Will you grow a mustache, though, my friend?
Yes. I will do my best. Just tell me what the pay is. Just give me an advance, and I'll go and get some special hair care stuff.
Next, we talk about performing all over the world and how Aisha seeks to center herself and remain genuine on stage, regardless of what country or atmosphere she's in. We pull a little bit from the last segment in terms of representing yourself honestly, especially on stage. We examine the tightrope walk that many entertainers face between being offered opportunities that may not always be a perfect fit for you and bringing something worthy of being brought in, shout out to Bring It On, to the table in your own life. It's a discussion about choosing what feels right to you and not necessarily following what others think is right for you. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, so does that, I guess, kind of knowing what you know now after being in entertainment and stuff like that, does it, has it changed like your outlook, like when you go other places and stuff like that? Kind of, I know how Canada and America, how they treat race differently and kind of different historical aspects and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Being in the other parts of the world, did that kind of expand your world view or kind of reinforce what Canada and America already?
I mean, I think America is sort of the hub when people talk about here, like the Western world and race and stuff. People default to America a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's different race wars and issues in different places, like the Middle East and all these. Like South Africa is a great example where apartheid and black versus white and all this, like, obviously racism exists in a lot of places, but then I lived in Korea for 4 years and race was just a totally different thing, where Koreans are Korean. Like, there is nothing else. It's just you've always been Korean or you haven't. Like, it's just like, it's so clear cut there. Everyone who's Korean looks a certain way. They know that I'm not Korean as soon as I walk in a room. Like, they're like, oh, that person's Japanese. And a lot of Americans are like, I don't know, what's you can't tell necessarily the difference, like, just looking. And a Korean will be like, that person's bone structure, they must be Japanese, So it's like very, it's just different. It's just interesting to see what those differences are like. And then you go to Europe where everything, you can drive to 3 different countries in a couple different hours, and you see how racism obviously still exists and identifying race and background and these things, but it's a lot more, people speak many languages, people are more aware of politics that are happening around them, people are more interested in the plight of others, I think, in certain ways. Interracial relationships, like you look at England, that's been a thing for a long time. That's not something, like that's stuff that's been on TV, stuff that's been everywhere, so it's not as big of a deal to people as it has been in America or in South Africa, for example. Just thinking of places I've been to.
Does it? Well, I guess it wouldn't frustrate you. I guess when you come to America and you just see how fixated people are, like how deep it is in all different aspects. Do you try to kind of after living in all those different places, do you kind of try to block some of that out as deep as it gets here?
Like people's inherent feeling about race, or what do you mean?
Yeah, just kind of like, you're black, and then like you do black things, and you're kind of just.
It's so interesting. I mean, the truth is, you come somewhere, and as an entertainer and someone who's trying to get somewhere and get, like, I want to be seen, I want to get on roles, I want to get on shows and stuff. If someone's like, I'm gonna put you on a black show, I'm like, great.
Yeah.
Great, I will take it. If someone's like, I want to put you on an all-female show, I'm like, Like, I'm not saying no to these things, because if someone were to say, like, I'm going to put you on a disability show, it's a different thing. Like, that has happened before to me, where when I first started, it's so funny. It's like, when you first start and you just have no clue what you're doing in anything. And there was this group, and they were, it was like a resource group to help people with disabilities live independently. And they were looking for comedians, and they had able-bodied, not, people who had disability, they wanted a mix. Which is great. And I was like, great, I can do that. I'm able-bodied, but I can definitely come do the show and be entertainment for the event you're having. And then one of the women who was organizing it said, would you mind writing some jokes for about disabilities? And this was like the first maybe couple months I've been doing comedy, and I was like, oh, is this how? Okay, yeah, sure, whatever. Yeah, I'll do it. And so, and then I went to the show, and the first 3 people who went on all had a disability of some kind and talked about their experience in that in a comedic way. And then they're like, okay, now you. And I was like, oh God, like, what have I got myself into? And I did normal jokes, like my regular set. And then I told this one joke about how I was like, the other day I was going to the bathroom and the power went out. And I was like, for the first time ever, I was like, I get, like, when people are blind, like, I was lost. I was trying to make it self-deprecating, where I was like, I was lost. I'm like, what do I do next? Do I wipe? Do I wash? And I was like, I became an idiot the instant that the lights went out, which I still think is a funny, premise, because I really was lost. And I'm like, I know how to do this. Like, you know how to go to the bathroom. But, and I was saying how I thought it was like a real superpower when people were able to do things without sight. And people were laughing, and then there was just one woman in the front row with her arms crossed, just like, shaking her head. And of course, as comedians, that's the only person you see. Yep. And then I told another joke about how I saw somebody parking in handicap parking, but they didn't have, there was nothing, they didn't have a placard, there was nothing wrong with them. And I was like, no, idiot parking's way over here. And then she got back on board, and she was like, okay. But it made, afterwards, the learned lesson was only do something that you feel comfortable doing, and don't speak to things that you have no business speaking to, unless it's like, you've experienced something in it. You don't have to be the person with a disability necessarily, but if you have friends with disabilities and you're talking about that friendship or whatever, and punching, yourself in the face versus being like, I'm going to make fun of disabilities and stuff.
Hey, this guy in the front row, let's do it.
Yeah. And it's funny, the organizer came to me afterwards, and she's like, I don't know why I asked you to do that. That was a really unfair question. And I'm like, thank you for, I'm like, I also realize that now. But she was like, thank you. You did a good job. But
who cares? I came through unscathed.
Yeah. I'm like, I got paid. But yeah, I think it's speaking to what you know or experience or your feelings about it, and talking about your experience in that. Yeah. You don't have to be black to talk about black people necessarily, I think. But you better have a good reason of why you're talking about that. If you're some white guy, you know what I mean? It's like, why are you talking about this? Are you making fun of it? Are you punching down? Are you just making observations? Because no one gives a shit, you know? But if you have, it's like, if you have some experience that's valuable and interesting and relatable and is fun for everybody who's involved in that, black people, white people, whatever people, then I think we should be able to talk about what we know and not be held to some, just what other people think of us.
I get that a lot. Because my son is mixed, but I'm not. So I toe that line, I think, a lot of times when I try to touch on a lot of mixed race stuff, but I can only do it from me.
Exactly.
I can't talk about like stuff that he's going to encounter or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, if I ever did that.
But it's like you can talk about a dad of a mixed kid because that's your experience, right? And like the differences and stuff like that, I think. But I mean, for me, I don't talk about white things necessarily, but I have as much right to talk about white things as I do about black things because I'm half, you know what I mean? But no one wants to hear, like, everyone's like, you're black, so you should talk about black things. I'm like, what about the white side? You know, that's the other side of it. But
Lastly, I asked Aisha about how big of a deal the interracial aspect was within her own family. I wanted to know if her exposure to family history of each parent was balanced or if one overshadowed the other. We get into a great discussion about doing your own family history research and how rewarding it is when you find something. And lastly, I asked Aisha to take it all home with some advice for other mixed people out there trying to find and make their own way. Here's Aisha one more time.
I think the first question about my family history, all of my grandparents have passed away quite a while ago, so I don't really have that avenue. And I mean, I don't think either sets of them really would. I mean, my mom's parents, who they didn't really talk that much about background and stuff like that. My dad's parents didn't speak English, I think, well enough to maybe necessarily express everything all the time. But recently, I think because I grew up mostly with my mom's family, I know more about that. I know more about like their life and their experiences growing up like on the farm and in rural Manitoba in Canada. And recently I've been piecing together more and more of my dad's side of things and, you know, the stories from back in the day. And, you know, as being a Nigerian, the first thing everyone asks you is like, what's your tribe? And it was really interesting because I was like, I don't really know because my family speaks Hausa and Yoruba, but like grew up in the north. Like I was like, I don't really. And so trying to piece that together, answer is Nupe actually, and which I did not know.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So, but like there's a string that connects them to other different, you know, tribes as well and languages and experiences. But yeah, I think that there's, especially now, if I'm going to identify as part Nigerian, I should know more than I do about Nigeria and history and the goings on now. And now that there's a comedy scene in Nigeria, I'm like, I gotta know. Oh yeah, there's like a full on, like, what's his, Buckethead or something like that. I think there's a major name of the guy, but the comedy style is very different. And so it'd be kind of cool to do a trip over there and see what it's like or experience that.
Yeah. That would be super interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like I think it's important for me to know more and more about my Nigerian side because I've lived and experienced a lot of the Canadian side. I never lived in Nigeria. I never, you know, went to school there or anything like that. So I've missed out on that just by not being there. So it is something that's very important to me to learn, and I'm learning more and more about. It's hard though because it's like all through my father, and so it's through his lens as well. And also he had a really tough, hard life that's hard to talk about, I think. So it's like small stories here and there that I literally sometimes like I'm writing down while I'm talking to him on the phone so that I can remember stuff and piece it together with this and that and know where like the family history lies. And I found out we have like a family house in Nigeria that my father's father built for everybody that like no one ever lived at. I'm like, let me go claim that then. Let's go over there and take a, you know.
It's all massive.
Yeah, I'm like, what's up? So just stuff like that where you're like, okay, that'd be kind of cool to go back and see and, you know, do like the great walk of our life and visit the places that my family has history in. That's awesome. Which would be kind of cool. I mean, it's tough because you got to find a safe time, which is hard in Nigeria, but yeah, so that's where I'm at with that. And then as far as like talking to my former self, I think like my parents did a great job of really just eliminating barriers of stuff. I think part of it too is I think it's important to talk about that stuff too and talk about the racism they experienced through stories or through experiences and talk about you know, what's happening in the world. Our family doesn't really talk a lot about politics. We don't talk a lot about like, you know, current events and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if that's because it's such a touchy part of their lives and was such a hard thing to deal with for so long, or if it's just we don't do it, you know? So I think that stuff would be really important and to like talk about your experience and be honest about things, you know? Having lived before around mostly Canadian, white, European immigrants and people, you know, being considered, the other for me, like she's the black one. And then I'm like, oh, okay, like, but I'm mixed, or I'm this, or speaking up for that stuff, and coming here and being put in the category of black, and people, expecting me to be able to speak to the black experience in America, where I'm like, I cannot do that right now. Like, there's things I experience from my lens or my perspective, but it's not the same as a black woman who grew up here necessarily.
It's like not letting other people dictate the terms of what
Yeah,
you talk about,
like, know who you are best. And even if someone says, but you're this, if that doesn't agree with your person, then you need to either speak up to it or, educate them or replace that with something else, because it's really easy to feel lost in your own identity when someone else decides it for you. So it's important to figure it out for yourself, and that could evolve and change, but to be present and aware of those things, I think, is a really important thing.
Truth.
Quotable quotes with
That's
Aisha Alpha.
Mic drop. I'm gonna put in like a bam. You gotta get a hype man for this show. You can't believe you just heard that.
All right, guys, that is it for this episode of The Hamster Village. I want to thank Aisha for taking the time to sit down with me and talk about her life. I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and listen to Aisha's life and to me babble like this all the time. And for all the mixed people out there, I hope when you listen to this or when you're feeling down or like there's no one else around that might get your experiences, to think about this episode and just think of how big this world is and how many different experiences and things that are going on out there that you may not even know about. And one day you may be able to connect with those groups and share your experiences with someone who's gone through the same thing. I hope that happens for you in your life. And I hope that this is inspiring to show you that there's more out there than just what's in front of you. If you have any questions or comments, you can always find us at thehamstervillage.com. There's a contact page there. We also have a lot of social media, Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff. Find us there. You can write us there. We'll make sure the comments and questions get back to the show somehow. Or find me. I'm at nathanbrandon.com, or you can find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. And write me. I will make sure it gets back to the same place. Is that cool? If you have not subscribed to the podcast, you need to go ahead and do that. We're all over the place. Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play. So subscribe, tell your friends, write us, tell us about your experiences, all that stuff. We'd love to hear from you. All right, this has been another episode of The Hamster Village. My name's Nathan Brandon. We will catch you on the next one.